Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Authority, Legitimacy, and Justice. I'm going to have to go quickly. Normally this is an hour-plus lecture. If I'm going through the slides one by one, reading the slides is no fun, as you know. So what I'm going to do is try to give you the Cliffs Notes, give you the highlights, and try not to stick on one slide too much and avoid inevitable digressions. So the overview of this lecture, what we're trying to do here is to introduce some concepts about political authority, political legitimacy, political obligation, and their relationship to the idea of justice. And uh, I'm doing so using the frame of Plato's dialogue between Socrates and his friend Crito. There's a lot of other things that you could get from that particular dialogue. It's not only about political authority, it's about lots of things, but I think one of the things that it really highlights and does a good job at highlighting is the conflict between doing what's right um, and obedience to political authority. So the dialogue takes place after the trial of Socrates. The Plato recounts in a different dialogue called the Apology. Just to give you the setting, Socrates is tried and found guilty of corrupting the youth and impiety. Those crimes are much more serious at the time than they are now. Crito has organized a jailbreak. Crito's bribed the guards and has a ship waiting in the harbor. And Socrates just has to go and escape. But perhaps surprisingly, Socrates tells Crito that no, he's going to accept his death sentence and he's not going to take the opportunity to escape to another city. So why does Socrates refuse to escape? A lot of people have puzzled on this question for the last couple thousand years. Socrates and Crito agree on a bunch of things. They agree that the conviction is unjust. After all, Socrates in the Apology pleaded not guilty. He defended himself. Even if you agree that Socrates is guilty, the sentence does seem overly harsh, and a lot of people at the time thought so as well, at least the best we can tell. But Socrates says, no, I have to stay and accept my fate. In fact, he says that justice demands it. How can we make sense of this weird position? The conviction on the one hand that the sentence is unjust, and on the other that he has a duty to submit to it. So in order to make sense of this proposition, I want to separate two ideas. The idea of doing the right thing from the idea of the right to do something. And again, here we don't need a fully fledged theory of justice. This works actually with just about any theory of justice and any theory of authority that you can think about. Doing the right thing and having the right to do something end up coming apart. So there's important distinction between doing the right thing and having a right to do something. I just said that. Here are some examples. I think for many people in America, the right to free speech encapsulates that, right? Someone will say, hey, you shouldn't say that, and what's the American response? The American response is it's a free country, I have the right to say whatever I want. The response is usually only partially successful because after all, just because you have the right to say whatever you want, it's your decision doesn't mean that any decision you make is just fine. There are things that you probably shouldn't say even though you have a right to say them. So, what does this have to do with Socrates? Well, Socrates is ultimately saying that Athens has the right to condemn him. That is, in other words, a question of political authority. Athens is in charge. It's Athens' decision to make. But Athens isn't always going to get it right. Does that mean that Socrates is free to disobey Athens anytime that Socrates thinks that Athens gets it wrong? He says that's an absurd principle. It's a principle that refutes itself because, after all, every criminal thinks that the trial was unfair, that they were either not guilty or that the sentence was overly harsh. And if every criminal ultimately decided what their own punishment was going to be, we'd have a hard time containing crime. So the fact that Athens is wrong in one particular case doesn't mean that Socrates' duty lapses. So Socrates may not be due execution, but Athens is still due obedience. So let's introduce political authority. Political authority is a moral power. It's a moral power to create obligations for citizens. In other words, as a citizen of a country, if you are under authority, you're going to acquire moral obligations or moral privileges that you did not previously have merely because the government bestowed them on you. And this is the key point. You acquire certain obligations merely because your government says so. That might seem weird to you, but let's talk about it further. So authority, like I said, is a moral power. It doesn't have anything to do really with physical power. I say it has nothing to do with it. That's probably wrong. I think authority without any power is problematic at some level, but we don't have to think about that just yet. What's important to note is that there's no logical relationship with actual political power. You can have a situation where people who have political authority are not the people with political power, and vice versa. You can imagine very unjust governments who have power, that is to say they have the capacity to make you do what they want you to do, but they perhaps have no authority, that is to say no moral standing to give you orders. So political power is the capacity to coerce, to make people do things. Political authority is the right to command, right? The right to command citizens, and that's going to be very important. And of course, that distinction gets, I think, blurred when we talk about the authorities. Actually, it gets blurred in a number of ways because authority can also refer to knowledge, and it's not always clear that authority comes from knowledge. That is to say, political authority comes from knowledge. So, if I say that Professor so-and-so is an authority on Egyptian antiquities, I'm not saying that he has the right to tell me what to do about anything. I'm just saying that he's very knowledgeable about that. If I say I'm going to call the authorities, I'm not yet agreeing that those people that I'm calling have the right to do anything. I'm just saying I'm going to call the people with political power, and that's all I'm really committing to. So again, in the way we use the word authority in everyday life, it gets muddled. We're going to use it in this course in a very specific sense, in the sense of having the moral power to coerce. Actually, the moral power to create obligations, to be very, very specific. So we're also not talking about legal authority, right? Legal authority might be established by the Constitution or statutes or court decisions, and there is such a thing as thinking about legal authority when you want to know whether a branch of government has the legal authority to do something. You can go to the text, a law book, a constitution. That's not going to be the case with political authority. If you want to know whether your government has political authority, going to the Constitution is beside the point, because ultimately the question of political authority is about whether the Constitution has the right to set up a government. In other words, who gave the Constitution the right to tell you what to do? And that is a deeper question than just going to the law books. Okay, so Socrates, his arguments should be familiar to all of us. I think there's a long tradition, well, as far as we know, starting with Socrates, but going through Jesus Christ and Martin Luther King and Gandhi, there's a tradition of individuals who challenge injustices. They protest, right? But they don't contest the authority of the state to make the decision. They are just trying to get the state to change its decision. And in some ways, Socrates is the original practitioner of civil disobedience, although remember, in the end, he comes down on the side of obedience. So, before moving on to what could give a state authority over citizens, to the point perhaps of taking their very lives, I do want to carve out one more distinction between political authority and political legitimacy. And again, I'm going to use these terms technically, in a technical sense. States around the world claim the right not just to impose duties on citizens, but also the right to punish them if they don't comply with those alleged duties, right? And those are two different things. One, the power to create a moral obligation. Two, the right to punish you for violating a moral obligation. And again, those things might usually be seen to go together, but you might come up with cases where one goes without the other. I'll give you the example of the Pope. The Pope, at least with respect to Catholics, may have the right to create political obligations as the voice of the church on earth, but the Pope does not have a right to kick down your door and make you take the Eucharist or something, or baptize your children. The Pope does not have a militarized police force outside the Vatican to make you obey his authority, but you might nonetheless concede that the Pope has the right to create those obligations. If the Pope says that Catholics must do something, Catholics may be so obligated. So again, the idea of political authority and the political legitimacy, and remember, political legitimacy is still a moral concept. It's still about the right to coerce. It's not about the power to coerce. It's not about whether someone can coerce you. It's whether it would be okay for them to coerce you if they could do so. So again, authority and legitimacy are not quite the same thing, and they're both distinct from political power. Okay. By the way, a lot of people when they talk about authority and legitimacy together, they talk about it as the right to rule. Okay, so the right to rule. Most political philosophers don't worry a lot about this distinction, but I think it's important to keep it in mind. It's possible to imagine states having no moral power to create obligations, but still having the power to enforce duties, for instance, natural duties. So an example might be, think of the most illegitimate state that you can think of, one which has no right to create obligations, maybe because it's a colonial state, maybe because it's some sort of fascist totalitarian nightmare. Let's imagine, say, Nazi Germany. Okay. Nazi Germany had many bad laws in the books, but they probably had some that made sense. They probably had some laws against murder, some laws against theft and fraud, and so on and so forth. And you might think that citizens still had a duty to obey those laws, even though they might have had a duty to disobey, resist other kinds of laws. And so, as a result, you might say that just because a government lacks authority, you might still have a moral duty to comply. It might still have a right to coerce, a limited right to coerce citizens, particularly when it's enforcing duties that, in fact, citizens already have. Okay. Leaving that alone. So, skip that. Let's ask ourselves, I think, the question that probably is in the back of your minds at this point, which is, what gives a state the right to rule? What gives a state political authority and legitimacy? Who made them boss, right? It's the question that every 5-year-old kid asks their parents. Who made you boss? Who gave you the right to tell me what to do? That's going to be a question, I think, that's at the basis of political theory, right? It's one of the most fundamental questions in political theory. Who gave you the right to tell me what to do? And Socrates gives us 3 answers. Like, he gives us an answer, but in reality, I think today we would separate it into 3 types of answers, 3 possible sources. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. It's not like you have to, if you endorse one, you can't also endorse the other. Any of these may be sufficient, or you might say neither is sufficient by itself to obligate, but all 3 together give you strong reasons. I'm going to be agnostic about that, just to note that. You don't have to pick and choose, but it's interesting to note that they are distinct sources of political authority. So one source might be reciprocity, second source might be consent, and the third is probably something to do with fair play. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about reciprocity. Athens gave Socrates many benefits. The core of reciprocity is the returning of favors, right? The returning of benefits that have been conferred upon you. If someone does you a favor, you owe them something in return. And what Socrates is pointing out is that he owes a lot to Athens. Athens has given him many favors, has protected him, has nurtured him, has given him an environment in which to teach and be free. And as a result, he owes Athens obedience as a consequence of all these favors that have been bestowed on him. So to flee now, he says, would be akin to renouncing your parents because they told you to go clean your room and you didn't want to do it, right? Socrates is saying you can't renounce your parents just because they're telling you to do things that you don't think you should have to do. And in the same way, you can't renounce your country just because your country is now telling you to do something that you disagree with. So that's reciprocity. Consent. Consent has to do with agreement, voluntary agreement. As a free man, Socrates notes that he could have left Athens at any time during his long life. He wasn't imprisoned by Athens. Furthermore, he was also free to get involved in politics and change the laws. Athens, during parts of Socrates' life, though not all of Socrates' life, was a democratic state. By staying throughout his life, by continuing his residence in Athens, Socrates is saying that his behavior implied that he had no problem with those laws, that he, in other words, agreed to them or consented to them. So the argument for consent says if you agree with a set of rules and then the rules end up not in your favor, you can't go back and say, oh, no, I'm not going to play by the rules. Imagine joining a poker game and saying, yes, I agree to a certain set of rules, and then the hand is dealt and you lose the hand. You say, no, I'm not going to pay up because I didn't. Because I lost, and I was like, no, that's not how that works, right? You agree to a set of rules, you've got to follow through on them. So Socrates says, okay, it didn't work out in my favor here, but overall I consented, and so I am bound. And finally, fair play. And again, this is bound up in the idea of consent, but it's slightly different, right? It might be the case that whether or not you agree to play in an activity or participate in an activity, you are bound nonetheless by duties of fairness to do your fair share, right? Socrates didn't choose a lot about his life. He didn't choose to be born in Athens. He didn't choose his parents. He didn't choose Athens. You might think that ultimately the consent argument's a bit wobbly, but he still participated and got the benefits from participation in a collective enterprise. And as a result, he might be bound by rules of fair play. So again, this is more to do with doing your fair share, right? Socrates needs to do his fair share to uphold the laws of Athens, and disobeying at this point, running away from his death sentence, would be shirking his duty to do his fair share as an Athenian citizen. In other words, if you're committed to a particular practice, you've got to go through with it, right? In this case, all the way to death, which is a pretty serious. I mean, you could imagine obligations of fair play stopping short of having to sacrifice your life. Like you owe something, but not that much. Okay. Now, Crito tries to object a little bit to Socrates. He tries to say, look, these arguments from reciprocity, from consent, from fair play, they've got some problems with them, right? You might think that Athens stopped playing by the rules, right? Fair play requires you to deal fairly in games that are fair. But if you think that the trial was rigged, for example, if you think that there was a conspiracy against Socrates, you might think that, once the system has stopped playing by the rules, then you are no longer obligated to uphold your end of the deal. So, for instance, if you have a duty not to hit people, but if someone hits you, it's probably the case that now you have permission to hit back. You can say they broke the rules first, and so your duties lapse. Socrates rejects Crito's argument. He says, look, I have a duty to do what's right no matter what other people do to me. It doesn't matter if others are behaving badly. My bad behavior isn't excused because others are doing it too. This is something that every parent tells their 5-year-old kid. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and Socrates is basically saying that in response to Crito's objection. Now, I think we can reformulate Crito's objection to be a little bit stronger. He could have said, look, you have a duty to play by the rules of a fair game that you agreed to play, but you did not agree to play an unfair game. And you might think the trial was unfair. But I think Socrates, although he doesn't respond exactly in this way, could respond to this argument. First of all, it's not up to me, Socrates, to decide whether the trial was unfair. It's not up to the criminal, the accused, to decide whether or not the trial process that he underwent was fair or unfair. Every criminal is going to be partial. That is to say, they're going to be way too self-interested to make an objective decision in their own case. So we have to look at the process. Was Socrates denied an opportunity to defend himself? Was it the case that the vote was suspiciously skewed, as in like dictatorships, where 98% of the people magically vote for the dictator, and you wonder, is there something weird going on there? But in this case, that's not the case, right? Socrates says, look, I have no good reason to think that this process was rigged. I was given the opportunity to defend myself. The vote was pretty close. I lost. I got to take the consequences, Socrates thinks. More generally, you might think, look, the question of who's being fair or who's being just is beside the point. That's not what we're trying to decide here. We're not trying to decide what's right. Remember, we're trying to decide who gets to decide. And guess what? It's not Socrates that gets to decide on this view. Socrates thinks that on questions of civil justice, on questions of criminal justice, it's up to the courts to decide, not up to the individuals. And so convicted criminals, in other words, do not get the right to decide for themselves whether or not they have a right to escape custody. If we made that into a rule in our criminal justice system, the interests of justice overall would not be served by allowing criminals to decide for themselves. And so at the end of the day, or by allowing accused criminals or alleged criminals to decide for themselves. And so we have a trial process in place. The question is who gets to decide, and the answer is emphatically not the accused or the condemned. Now, I'm not saying, and nobody is saying, that Socrates is right here. It might well be the case that at a certain point it is not up to the collective to decide, it's up to the individual. Certainly, if you are a fan of comic books or superhero movies, you can find a number of examples of people taking justice into their own hands, particularly when the system is corrupt or stacked against you, or when there's a conspiracy, and the hero has to take matters into his own hands, and those heroes are clearly, at least by the writers and screenwriters of the movie, deemed to be heroic and righteous in their refusal to abide by political authority, particularly when that authority is corrupt or just incapable of producing justice. But those are exceptions, not the rule. And whether those exceptions apply to Socrates' case, I think, is unclear, because if we might today think that the sentence is excessive, but again, we're substituting our judgment for the judgment of the people whose job it is to exercise that judgment. And so I think superhero movies and comic books are deeply problematic. I think Batman is deeply morally problematic from the point of view of political authority, because Batman is often deciding for himself to engage in vigilantism, and it's not clear whether or let's put it this way, it's not always clear that vigilantism is justified. There might be situations in which, when law and order breaks down, people have to take things into their own hands. But it's not obvious that that's the case with Socrates. Okay. From the point of view of ethical theory, taking a step back, abstracting a little bit, let's note the ethical issues here. Crito is I think making a consequentialist argument. He's saying, look, if you stay and die, that's bad, and we want to avoid bad things. Death is bad. The death of a great philosopher like Socrates is particularly bad. Nothing particularly bad happens to Athens if you escape, Crito thinks. At the end of the day, Athens is not harmed by this. Your many friends and acquaintances will be overjoyed. Again, the best consequences are for you to escape. There's no real reason for you to stay in jail. Socrates responds with a mix of what I would call deontological and virtue ethics argument. He says, look, what matters ultimately in life is not the consequences. It's the integrity. And he challenges the consequences too. He says, well, if I die, I'm 80. I don't have that many years to live. If I die, it's not the end of the world. But you can't worry about how other people feel. You can't worry about the opinions of other people. Trying to please people is not the soul of ethical behavior or ethical judgment. What Socrates needs to do is decide what justice requires. And in some ways, it's looking at the journey, not the destination. It says, look, we're all going to die sooner or later. What matters is how we live, right? And whether we live rightly or wrongly, and whether we live up to our duties or not. And he's ultimately saying there are things more important than life. Or should I say, consequences are not the best way to judge actions, at least not in this particular circumstances. So, stepping back again, looking at Socrates' life, right? Socrates was well known for questioning authorities. He's not the first person you would think who would ultimately come down on the side of the authority. He spent his entire life walking around pointing out how foolish people are, how narrow-minded they are, how much they don't know about the world. He was literally condemned to death for challenging tradition, for challenging the way things have always been done. And for that reason, he's always been admired on the left as a wrongly accused progressive, someone who was trying to move his society forward, but he got ultimately beaten down by the man, right, by the authorities. And so in that sense, Socrates is very much an anti-authoritarian figure. But as you see in this particular, at the end of his life, right, Socrates seems to come down on the side of authority. He comes down on the side of order, personal piety, political authority, and for that, he is much admired by conservatives, someone who dies to defend the values of political authority, obedience to the law, social stability. These are conservative virtues and by no means progressive or revolutionary. So we can ask ourselves, I think, justly, whether Socrates is a hero of the left or a hero of the right. And I think both sides of the political spectrum have reasons to claim him. Okay, one thing that it's pretty clear, at least from what we know from Plato, is that Socrates is a philosophical elitist and he's a philosophical idealist, right? He's an elitist because he thinks the people, whether rich or poor, are generally ignorant. And even worse than that, they believe that they're right and they're really often not, right? And so that we should ignore the opinions of most people. We should focus on the truth. We should articulate the judgments the best we can. We should investigate matters, but ultimately, popular opinion should generally be ignored. He's also an idealist, right? The world is not fair. The world is not just, but just because injustice is all around us doesn't make it okay to add to it, right? Just because other people are being unjust doesn't mean that you have a right to respond, right? So he says you need to worry about your own conduct, not worry so much about the world in general. We need to worry about what we can control, and that is our own actions. And so in that sense, he's, again, a kind of philosophical idealist. We need to do the best we can, live up to our ideals as best we can. We're not social engineers, and we're not certainly going to respond to injustice with more injustice. So from this angle, in today's world, Socrates doesn't fit very well within left and right politics. Okay, so that was still almost a half an hour lecture, and I apologize for how long it is, but I think there's lots of juicy issues here, and I want you to think a little bit, what would you do in Socrates' situation? Do you think that political authority is worth dying for? Do you think that you have a duty to ultimately obey the law and be a good citizen, or do you think that ultimately sometimes the law goes too far and sometimes you have the right to substitute your own judgment for the judgment of those whose job it is to make those decisions? Thanks for listening.